Hello everyone, today we're going to be covering some of the top decks that you're going to be able to use going into the new season of Marvel Snap to be able to hit Infinite as quickly as possible and just dominate the ladder. First off, if you haven't played for a couple of weeks, if you haven't seen the High Evolutionary takeover, he is very, very strong. And so if you don't know how to play against it, if you don't have it, it can be kind of difficult to climb consistently. And so it's no surprise that with his takeover, the deck that I'm slotting in at number 1 as the best deck to climb going into this new season is a High Evolutionary Control. There are a couple ways to build this one, and depending on how you lean into it, you can either lean into like the Misty Knight, Sunspot, Soak method, where you're going to still be leaning into like a Storm on 3, a Cyclops on 4, but you have a little bit more flexibility in ways that you can float your power. Now, the first and the most popular version does drop the Professor X that I had in my original Control High Evolutionary build, and it still does really decently. It leans a little bit away from controlling the board state so much, and more so into soaking and floating and just getting a good amount of power spread across the board every single turn of the game. And so this one does do very, very well if the opponent doesn't have a way to impact multiple lanes. If they don't have scaling power, then it's going to be very hard for them to face into you. Some of the strengths of the deck are that it forces a lot of retreats. It is going to put opponents into unwinnable positions. And so if you can identify that, you could snap into it a little bit earlier than you would normally. You're probably going to get a lot of 2-cube games versus those 4 and 8-cube just burst of games, but you will get them very, very consistently. The next strength is that it has scaling power. Being able to throw a Cyclops into a lane and negatively afflict the opponent's cards, or yours can scale with your Sunspot, with your Nebula in those locked down lanes so that you can focus on winning one of the other two. This is also going to be good against Galactus and Bounce, and we know that at the start of the season, Galactus takes a chokehold. If there is not a strong meta against it, Galactus comes out in spades because it's a very easy to run deck. It's very consistent for the most part, and it's just easy to slam 20, 30, 40 games compared to trying to calculate each and every power-up that comes with a Bounce deck. And so it's good against Galactus and Bounce, which is a plus in my book. And for the next strength that we have of this deck, it is unbothered by wave. As long as that wave comes down on the later turns, you're typically only going to be playing 1 or 2 cards per turn anyways, and so wave doesn't really impact you or this deck as much as it does other decks. Now for weaknesses, we have a few. It is susceptible to counterlock, and so if the opponent is playing heads up, they can stop you from dropping the behemoth that is the Evolved Hulk. They can counterlock you, they can change the storm location, and you lose a lot of your board security in the process. So it is susceptible to counterlocks if the opponent can be putting good value plays all throughout the game. And it's also susceptible to scaling opponent power, so Soak style decks, Surfer style decks. We don't run the Killmonger, we don't run counter tools, so if the opponent can get a card in place in that lockdown lane that is going to outscale us doing a Cyclops, us doing a Wasp, us doing a last turn Doctor Doom, then we can't really do much about it after that. And so it is susceptible to some of those more common plays, but those are still typically very draw dependent, and you can most of the time outposition and outpower them. Now, next up on the list, I have Bounce, and I tentatively put this at number 2 because it could adjust depending on what the meta shifts towards. If we see a lot of Lockdown, if we see a lot of Galactus, Bounce is not as impactful. In the perfect world, Bounce is one of the highest power output consistent decks in the game, but it's very susceptible to things like Wave. It's very susceptible to things like Lockdown, so Spider-Man, Professor X, or Galactus. And so the strengths are that it has a lot of power and it's very consistent. Weaknesses, it doesn't have any counterplay. If the opponent gets a good Lockjaw flip, you're stuck. You're stuck with playing for the other 2 locations if you can't outpower whatever they put in that high power lane, and it's very limited by the lockdowns and the waves. And then next on the list, we have a Lockjaw deck. Lockjaw or Jane Foster Lockjaw Thor rotation decks have always been somewhat decent. And with the addition of High Evolutionary, they have just gone massive. They have gone nuclear. They have incredible high roll potential. They're resistant to wave. They're flexible depending on the meta, so you can build them differently depending on what you're seeing. And they can outpower Bounce and Control decks if you get a good draw, if you get a good rotation. Now, there are some drawbacks to this. It can sometimes hang too much power in that one lane, and so then it can become susceptible to things like Shang-Chi or Valkyrie, swinging those locations back in the opponent's favor. They are also somewhat susceptible to Galactus. If you don't get a Magneto, if you don't build in a Magneto, an Arrow, you don't have very many Galactus counters. And so if you're seeing a lot of that and you flip into an Infinite and an Evolved Hulk in one lane, Galactus is going to laugh as it comes down and makes you kneel in the other location. And then also as a weakness, it can get bad draws. It is very RNG dependent. If you don't get your good rotation tools, then it can become kind of lackluster. The good thing is those are easy to anticipate. You see that you have a bad draw, you can retreat out for one rather than trying to force it for multiple cubes. And this is somewhat alleviated by having Chavez to give us a better consistency on drawing into like our Sunspot to soak, our Lockjaw for those rotations, but it's still not a surefire draw anyways. And so overall, I think this is going to be an incredible list to climb depending on how the meta shifts. It can be susceptible to certain things, and so play it accordingly depending on what you're facing into. Next up, I have Galactus. Galactus is one of those that you either love it or you hate it. It is no in between. It is pretty consistent. It's only around a 53% win deck, but it's very easy to read. So similar to the old Shuri line, you could snap pretty confidently as soon as you saw that you had your combo ready to drop down. And so it's very consistent in that you can easily read, you can churn through games much faster than trying to do the calculations of a Silver Surfer build, of a bounce build, of trying to counter their play with a Shang-Chi and trying to get in the mind of the opponent. You can very easily churn and burn those games so you can get through a lot more in a lot shorter time span. So even though you're only going to be winning about 53% of the games on average, you can be turning through more games in that shorter time span. And so as far as the negatives go, it's Galactus. And so I think that goes as a negative just by itself. I don't have a problem with Galactus, but it can be very oppressive. And if it is too common, it is very, very frustrating as a player that's not playing a Galactus deck. It can also be impacted by counterlock. The opponent can drop a Spider-Man, the opponent can drop a Professor X in the anticipated Galactus lane. And then even if you have something like a Nimrod or a Wolverine, then it may not be able to bounce over there if the lane is locked down before your Galactus reveals. And so it can be beaten by a good heads-up player, and the opponent's much more likely to spam snap you if they get one of those cheeky reads off, and it came down for 4 or 8 cubes. And then the next weakness is debris and locations can hurt. There are some ways to build this where debris is less impactful, so like the turn 6 version or just in your standard one that runs a ramp tool into a destroyer, but it's still not a surefire way to win. You can clear up the locations, but it still becomes much more difficult to get the combo off in the process. And next up, I put Hitmonkey Sera. This is one that always sits around the top of the cube rate, and that's because you can steal a lot of big games away from the opponent and surprise them for 4 and 8 cube games. Whereas some of the other decks are incredibly consistent, you're going to be getting 1 and 2 cube gains. This one is designed more for just bursting and surprising the opponent to get those 4 and 8 cube games more often. But the drawback of that is that you have to be very patient with this deck. You're not going to be able to out-counter or out-maneuver or out-position every single deck every single time. And so you're going to have to play it patiently, you're going to have to play it rather defensively until you have a surefire way to counter. And so this one, for me, can be exhausting to play because it takes a lot of getting into the mind of your opponent and trying to figure out exactly what they're planning to do, what their deck consists of, and the best way to navigate around that. And so it can be very impactful, but it can also be rather tough to calculate, rather tough to navigate. And so I put this one a little bit lower than Galactus and a few of the others because they're a lot easier to navigate. They're very straightforward, and it's not as dependent on getting that read of your opponent. And then lastly, I have Silver Surfer. Silver Surfer is one of those that always hangs around the kind of top ranges. The top ranges, it is good depending on the meta. And so it's flexible. You can build it depending on what you're seeing. You can lean into a Cosmo, lean into a Rogue, lean into Killmonger a little bit more, lean into Shadow King if you're seeing like Shuri ramps, if you're seeing bounce, and you can get a lot of games swung back in your favor with some of those tech cards. And that's another huge pro of it, is that it naturally wants to run great tech and counter tools. And so you can run those Cosmos, you can run the Rogues, you can run the Killmongers without feeling like you're pecking them in outside of what your normal strategy is, because it just fits naturally into that deck's design. Silver Surfer is also really good at scaling power, so it's good against Control and Galactus. You can position your Brood into a Stormed lane, and then you can always pump power into that lane later, depending on if you have Nova, Silver Surfer. Some versions are going to run Wong and Silver Surfer, and if you use that after a Sera, you can really surprise the opponent with how much reach you're going to be able to get into those lanes. But with that comes a few drawbacks. It is semi-draw dependent. If you don't get Silver Surfer, if you don't get Brood, if you don't get your Nova plus Killmonger, you lose a lot of that potency and that ability to burst a lot of power into those lanes. And so it can be very draw dependent, which is typically easy to retreat or snap accordingly, but it is a pretty big deficit if you don't get those key resources. It also has a lower max power ceiling, so it's bad into decks like Bounce, decks that are kind of unimpacted by Cosmo, unimpacted by those tech choices. It could be kind of difficult to navigate. Now, the good thing is a Bounce deck will typically have a lot of one-cost cards. Bad thing is it also has things like Hitmonkey. It has things like a scaled-up Bishop, a scaled-up Angela that can get absurdly large over the course of the game. And overall, I think there are a lot of viable decks. I think there are also some notable mentions like a Hawk deck or the Thanos Bounce Control that I covered recently, Electro Ramp that I covered recently. I think all of those will be able to climb pretty consistently depending on how the meta shifts. And it really depends on what is popular at that time that will dictate which one of these kind of rise up to the top. And so I think this is a very flexible meta that we're going into. I do think there are a few front runners, but a lot of decks do feel viable going into the start of the season. And so I'd love to know what decks you're running to start the season. If I covered one of the archetypes or I didn't cover one of the archetypes and you have something that you think is a hidden gem, leave it in the comment section down below. I'll be taking a look at them, trying them out over the first couple of days of the season. And if there's any that just do insanely well, then I would love to feature your decks. And so overall, I think we're in a really good meta state. I think we're in a good place. I think there are a lot of viable options. I am excited to see this new season of Marvel Snap, and I'm even more excited for Conquest Mode, where it's going to be highly competitive. And I feel like it's just going to be a breath of fresh air. It's going to be a brand new experience. And I think it's going to be a lot more tactical and a lot more strategic than what we necessarily see on the ranked ladder. And so let me know what you think in the comment section down below. As always, this has been TLSG. Later, guys.